The Siege of Gondor is one of the largest battles in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The Battle of Helm's Deep, while epic, just can't compare to the sheer scale and length of Sauron's attack on Gondor's capital city. Everything from Osgiliath being taken to the Ride of the Rohirrim is a heart-pounding, action-packed fight that draws you into the finale of the film trilogy. Now, the same goes for the book, but there's almost an entirely different feeling to Tolkien's original version of this event. I wouldn't say the book version is drawn out, but rather it is jam-packed with tension and details which make you feel like you're sitting in Minas Tirith experiencing the battle for yourself. And while Jackson did a great job adapting this for the silver screen, I believe everyone should have an understanding of what really went down in the books, because the movie omits crucial details and characters, and on top of that, Peter Jackson decided to change one of the most important confrontations in the story, and break Gandalf's staff. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 38 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, Lord of the Rings edition. This is the show where I take the Lord of the Rings films and compare them to Tolkien's works scene by scene, page by page. As you can tell, today we're covering the Siege of Gondor, but I should clarify that for the rest of the series, it's pretty much impossible for me to go scene by scene in the movie chronology. Obviously, there are 4 different perspectives happening all at once in the movie, which means that Peter Jackson cuts back and forth between the plot lines like crazy. In an effort to avoid giving you whiplash, I've compiled all the scenes in the movie that relate to Tolkien's chapter in The Return of the King called The Siege of Gondor. From now on, for Movies vs. Manuscripts, I'll be taking this approach. Each week, I'll choose a specific plotline and just select those scenes. Now, to clarify, we aren't covering the resolution of this battle today. We're just looking at everything from the time of Pippin lighting the beacon to the Rohirrim arriving at the Pelennor Fields. Before we go any further though, I wanted to give a shout out to this commenter from a previous episode. Each week, I highlight one of the top comments from a past video, so be sure to share your thoughts down below when you're done watching. Per usual, I'll cover all the changes across the 4 major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, let's recap what happens during these scenes in the movie. And remember, I'll be skipping the cuts and only going over the siege scenes. There are quite a few this week, about 40 minutes worth, so I'm gonna do my best to avoid spending 10 minutes only on a movie recap. So picking up with where we left off last week with Frodo and Sam, the movie cuts to Gandalf giving instructions to Pippin for a special task he has for him. Pippin then runs off and the movie cuts to Osgiliath, where the orcs are beginning to invade. After a bit of a fight sequence, we cut back to Pippin to see him lighting the beacon of Gondor, and then we listen to one of the best parts of the soundtrack as the beacons continue to be lit along the mountains. Eventually, they reach sight of Edoras and Aragorn sees the beacon, and he runs to Meduseld to alert the king. Theoden responds and says that Rohan will answer the call, and the muster of Rohan begins. Merry then pledges himself to the king, and we also see Éowyn preparing to ride with the men to Dunharrow. That's it for the Rohan scenes though, as the movie cuts back to Minas Tirith and we see Faramir and his men retreating in the open field, while being picked off by the Nazgul. Thankfully, Gandalf and Pippin ride out to save the day, and Gandalf uses the power of light and friendship to fend off the fell beasts. After they make it inside the city gates, Faramir recognizes a halfling, and Gandalf asks him if he's seen another. Faramir then says he saw Frodo just a few days ago, and that they were heading to Cirith Ungol. The next thing we see of the White City is Faramir debriefing his father, and his father of course getting upset. Then the Witch King orders his army to go forth and begin the assault. Next, we see Pippin talking with Faramir, and we learn that Pippin's livery is Faramir's childhood wardrobe. After this lighthearted moment, these 2 characters meet up with Denethor, who is enjoying a nice meal, and Denethor tells Faramir to go reclaim Osgiliath. Then we watch as Faramir rides out and Pippin sings a nice song. After Denethor's iconic tomato scene, some time passes and we see Faramir getting dragged back inside the city and somehow still breathing. After Denethor sees his son dying and tens of thousands of orcs outside his city gates, he goes mad, and Gandalf has to bonk him on the head. Gandalf then takes charge and the battle rages on. During this fight sequence, we see Pippin save Gandalf, the enemy use Grond, and Denethor taking Faramir to the tombs to be burnt. Pippin is then released from service as he tries to defend Faramir, and so he runs into the city to find Gandalf and tell him what is happening. Eventually, after the enemy has broken down the front door, Pippin finds Gandalf and tells him about Faramir, and Gandalf picks up the hobbit and they ride off. But before they can make it to the pyre, they are stopped by the Witch King, who fires up his sword and then breaks Gandalf's staff. And then right in the nick of time, just before the Witch King is about to cut up Gandalf, the Rohirrim arrive. And that, my friends, is the speedy version of some not-so-speedy scenes. But now let's dive into our analysis, starting with our character, timeline, and location changes. First up for characters, this week's changes are about quality over quantity. Although there aren't a lot of characters missing, the few people we do get to see are some of the most integral to Tolkien's version of the Siege of Gondor. First, we're missing Beregond, who you may recall as Pippin's best friend in the city. Then, we also don't get to see Prince Imrahil, who might be one of the most important people when it comes to the battle itself. Then there's one slight character change with someone we do see, which is Gothmog. He's portrayed as an orc in the film, but it's unlikely that he was one. Although it's never confirmed, a lot of people believe that Gothmog was one of the other 9 Nazgul who took over after the Witch King was killed. But hey, it can be left up to interpretation. Next, when it comes to timeline, things are slightly messed up, but ultimately it isn't that different. There might be a few extra hours here or there that aren't accounted for in the movie, but that's just the sacrifice you have to make for a film format. Like I said at the beginning of the video, Tolkien's version is just much more immersive because he can spend the time sprinkling paragraphs of details here and there to round out the feeling that was in the city. I won't count this as a strict timeline change, so for this week, this category gets a pass. Finally, before plot changes, we need to address location. First, we're missing Helm's Deep, which I'll explain more in the next part of the analysis because it relates way more to a plot change. And second, we once again are missing Ramis Ekor, the wall that surrounded the entirety of the Pelennor and the White City itself. I think visually it was just easier for them to make things an open field because adding a wall in post would have added a whole other complex layer of CGI to the film. So I get why they made this decision. Anyway, before diving into the plot, I just want to remind you that I can't go word for word through the dialogue. So if you're curious and want to check things out for yourself, I'd highly encourage you to check out the audiobooks on Audible. You can claim your free trial using my link in the description, which supports the channel and gets you one free audiobook of your choice. But that being said, let's get into the analysis. The first change we have this week seems like a simple one, but actually starts an avalanche of other changes regarding the overall narrative of the story, and specifically Rohan. The simple part is that Pippin doesn't light the beacon in Minas Tirith. In fact, the beacon was already lit, and Gandalf and Pippin had seen it while riding to the White City. But just to give you a little background, the beacons of Gondor are mostly for the people of Gondor. You see, since the realm of Gondor is so spread out, these beacons help to alert all the provinces of the land that Minas Tirith was under attack and Gondor was at war. This is what calls in all of the reinforcements that we learned about in a previous episode, including one of our primary missing characters, Prince Imrahil. So what did they use to alert Rohan? Well, there was a separate messaging system they used for that alliance, which was the Red Arrow. This arrow was a symbolic relic that would be taken from Minas Tirith to the King of Rohan as a sign that Gondor was requesting aid. We learn in the book that the Red Arrow made it to King Theoden, but the messengers were killed on their way back to Minas Tirith. This is what creates so much tension in the book, because the people of Minas Tirith never got confirmation that Rohan had answered the Red Arrow, and therefore they didn't know if the Rohirrim would arrive. But anyway, that's just some extra info. As for the movie, this change of having Pippin light the beacon brings on a few other changes regarding Rohan. First, Rohan was already at Dunharrow mustering their forces. If you've been watching the series, you'll recall from a previous episode that King Theoden and his men went from Isengard to Helm's Deep and then to Dunharrow to meet up with the rest of their people. They didn't go to Edoras to party it up after the Battle of Helm's Deep like the movie showed earlier on. Second, Aragorn isn't even with the King's company because he and the Grey Company parted ways with them at Helm's Deep. So this part of Aragorn seeing the beacon and then running to Theoden wouldn't have happened. Third, we see the mustering of Rohan commence as the people of Edoras start packing up for the journey and Merry pledges himself to Theoden. Well, this part with Merry does happen in the book and he is named the King's Esquire, however it doesn't happen in Edoras, and it doesn't happen at Dunharrow. It actually happens at Helm's Deep. Remember I mentioned that the King and his company stopped at Helm's Deep after they finished up at Isengard? Well, they eat a meal there and spend the night there, and Theoden fulfills a promise he made to Merry earlier on in the story and eats with the halfling. Merry is overcome with gratitude and offers his services to the king, very much like Pippin offering himself to Denethor. And now the fourth and final change regarding the people of Rohan, before we head back to Minas Tirith, is that Éowyn was already at Dunharrow. Before the Battle of Helm's Deep in the book, the women and children went to Dunharrow while the Rohirrim went to fight the Uruk-hai. So Éowyn was already at this fortified refuge the whole time waiting for the king to arrive. So the scene of her riding with them and taking her sword is made up. She will have her warrior moment later on, but for now, the women and children are already at Dunharrow, so there's no need for her to fake anything. And on that note, we can travel back to the White City as we have plenty more changes to cover there, including Gandalf's encounter with the Witch King himself. Our first change on this list is actually a brief omission, as the movie skips over Gandalf and Pippin's morning with Denethor. The last we saw of Pippin, he had gone to sleep, and the book picks back up with the next morning as Gandalf rouses him. He eats what little food Gandalf provides him, and then they both head to Denethor. Gandalf and the steward talk about strategy, Rohan, the oncoming battle, and more, and eventually Denethor instructs Pippin to go to the armories to get his livery. Which, by the way, is a small change, as in the movie we see him get his armor and weapon the previous night. But anyway, the next omission we have is Pippin's time with Baragond during his break. We read in the book that after the 11th hour, Pippin was released to go eat lunch, and during this break he ran into Baragond. Quick reminder, if you don't remember Baragond, he's a man of Minas Tirith who showed Pippin around during his first day in the city, and essentially Pippin's only friend there. Anyway, the two of them talk, and Pippin asks Baragond about the sky and the gloom. Baragond tells him that it isn't normal and is probably a device of the enemy. Sound familiar? Well, that's because this line is actually given to Gandalf earlier in the movie. I just forgot to mention it in my episode a couple weeks back, so I figured I'd mention it here. But now let's head into one of the key moments from our scenes this week, and that is Gandalf's first rescue of Faramir. Did I say first rescue? Oh yeah, stay tuned because in the book, Gandalf saves Faramir's life a second time. But back to this first one, there's two key differences. The first one is that in the book, Pippin is not riding horseback with Gandalf during this epic chase. He's actually up with Baragond, and I'll explain that here in a moment. The second change regarding this event is just how it all went down in general. I like the way Peter Jackson chose to do it on screen, but the way it occurs in the book is slightly different and perhaps more realistic. You see, as Baragond and Pippin are conversing during their break, they suddenly get struck dumb with fear as they hear the cry of a Nazgul, and they look out to see a group of riders racing toward the city. This group is of course Faramir and his men trying to escape the slaughter happening in Osgiliath. But Pippin and Baragond see that they're being picked off one by felt riders. This moment is a roller coaster of emotions, as at first, Baragond and Pippin think that the men will make it, but then they see the horses begin to go mad and throw their riders off their backs. And then they see Faramir turn around on his horse to go back and rescue the men who have fallen. The men not on horses begin sprinting toward the city, and Faramir tries to defend them. Thankfully, Gandalf comes out of nowhere, and just like we see in the movie, he scares off the Nazgul with his light, and then he and the men all make it safely back to the city. So as you can see, this moment was simplified a little bit on screen by adding Pippin riding with Gandalf and rewriting the part about the men falling off their horses with Faramir going back for them. By the way, just a brief side note here, a lot of the battle scenes today I can't really cover or criticize too much because we don't really get much of those details in the book. For example, the battle at Osgiliath that causes Faramir to flee is not discussed in the book, but it takes up a few minutes of the movie. So we're just skipping over a lot of those fight scenes today. And now that Faramir is back inside the city gates, we have our next change, as in the movie, we see Faramir recognize Pippin and tell Gandalf about Frodo right then and there after this near-death experience. But in the book, these three characters don't discuss this immediately. Rather, they wait and head to Denethor. After Faramir makes it inside the city, he's shocked to see another halfling, but Gandalf tells him that they must go see Denethor as they have no time to discuss things right then and there. We then read about how Faramir ate and then filled his father in on everything that had happened, including the fact that he had seen another halfling in Ithilien. He then mentions that they were resolved to go to Cirith Ungol, and Gandalf questions him about when this happened, much like what we hear in the movie. Of course, the key change here is that Denethor is involved in this conversation in the book. And after Faramir has finished talking, Denethor gets upset, saying that he knows Faramir didn't tell him everything. And he says that he noticed Faramir always looking toward Gandalf for direction. Similarly to the movie, Denethor obviously has a problem with his son being a wizard's pupil, as he puts it. And that brings us to the next change, which is that Denethor mentions he wishes Faramir and Boromir's places had been switched in this conversation, not in a later scene like what we see in the movie. Gandalf tells Denethor that Boromir would not have brought him the weapon, meaning the ring, but Denethor is steadfast in his belief. Ultimately, the conversation we see Faramir and Denethor have in the film is a good parallel to the book, with many points in the dialogue being the same. Obviously, the movie can't include every single line or else it would be another 12 hours long, but could they have kept it accurate with Gandalf and Pippin at least being there during this conversation? Probably. Anyway, moving on, Faramir, Gandalf, and Pippin are excused for the day, and they all go to rest, and then the book doesn't pick things back up until the following morning. Which means that our next small change is the addition of Faramir and Pippin's conversation. This never happens in the book, and I could be wrong about this, but the livery given to Pippin was not once Faramir's as a child. But like I said, this is a small change, and I don't mind it as it helps us get even more attached to the lovable Faramir. But now we pick things up the next day in the book, which starts with Denethor's council. It's not as epic as the Council of Elrond, but it's very similar in the sense that Denethor summons all of his captains to him, and they discuss their next steps. Now, this moment in the book is a direct parallel to Faramir's next scene in the movie, the one in which Denethor tells him to retake Osgiliath. In the movie, they only have Pippin and Faramir there as Denethor eats his meal, but in the book, it is a council in which this discussion occurs. Denethor tells all of his captains that he believes they should retake Osgiliath, as that is the last defense of their city, and pretty much all of the captains, including Prince Imrahil, say that this idea is folly. Prince Imrahil's involvement in this moment is key as it further reinforces his importance in the story. He is smart, brave, and one of the only ones with the courage to talk back to Denethor, telling him that they need to send reinforcements to Caradhras as well since they're expecting corsairs from Umbar to arrive there. But Denethor sticks to his plan and says that they can't afford to send more people to Caradhras. And just like in the movie, Faramir has something to prove and he accepts his father's fool's errand. Next, Pippin's singing in the movie never happens. This moment is quite epic in the film and one of the most popular moments overall in The Return of the King. But as far as I'm aware, and feel free to correct me in the comments, the closest thing we get to this in the book is Denethor asking Pippin if he can sing. Pippin then says that he doesn't have songs that are fitting for great halls and lords, and he ends up not singing anything as Denethor quickly moves on to his other activities. So Peter Jackson obviously pulled directly from this part of the chapter for inspiration, which happens right at the beginning by the way, and moved it to this scene, and then they custom wrote a song that Billy Boyd sings here. Now I just want to add in here that throughout the rest of the chapter, there are quite a few short paragraphs in which Tolkien adds details about the events that transpired during this battle, which lasted for days. I'm not going to go through all of them because they aren't really that crazy of changes or moments, and given that we're analyzing a film format, you don't really need these descriptive paragraphs from the book because you can just show them on screen. But one tiny line change I will mention before moving on is when Gandalf is asked if Rohan is coming. The same question gets posed to him in the book, and he firmly says yes, Theoden will come. However, the movie has him be silent and then tell the men of Gondor that courage is their best defense now. Small line changes like this one seem unimportant, but they're very telling about a person's character in the film versus the book. As we'll see, movie Gandalf seems weaker. I don't know if that's the right word, but the fact that he isn't confident Theoden will arrive, and the whole thing about his presence not really giving the men too much strength is contradictory to the book. The ring of power that Gandalf wears literally boosts confidence for those around him. But these movie-exclusive moments sort of set up the finale that we're covering today, which is Gandalf's encounter with the Witch King. But before we get there, we need to get back to our regular changes. Next on the list is the second rescue of Faramir. The movie only shows Faramir being dragged in by a horse, which, by the way, how in the world did that happen? Anyway, in the book, it's a little bit more realistic, as we get a full play-by-play of the event. Once again, Pippin and Beregond watch as Gandalf and Prince Imrahil ride out with their men to rescue Faramir's company. The craziest part of this, though, Denethor was in charge of sending out this rescue party. Although he wasn't the smartest strategically about it, Denethor was the one who sounded the trumpets to allow Gandalf and Imrahil to ride out. Then after a brief but fierce fight and retreat, Prince Imrahil was the one to carry in Faramir, who had been struck down by an arrow and found on the battlefield. They took Faramir up to his father, and that is when we get our following scenes with Denethor realizing the error in his ways. But hold up, we actually have one crazy omission before Denethor goes insane. This literally is a couple sentences in the book, but it gives us a glimpse into what causes Denethor to officially snap. After Faramir is brought to the citadel, Denethor instructs his servants to lay his son on a bed, and then he went up to a high tower where people could see sporadic flashes of light for a while. Then after some time, Denethor descended back down, the color having left his face, and this is when he gave up. So what was he doing in that high tower? He was looking into a palantir. If you didn't know, there are multiple, and in the book, Denethor had been using the one in Minas Tirith to gather information. It is how he knew much of the information Gandalf brought him already, and what empowered him to lead the city. But the palantir is a powerful device, and not meant to be used in the way Denethor was using it, and eventually it drove him mad, as Sauron continued to only show him the worst-case scenarios. Believing that winning was now an impossibility, he officially snapped, which is key because the movie shows Denethor as pretty much having snapped since our first scene with him. But anyway, now that he has snapped, we go back to our scene in the movie with him seeing Faramir and then going crazy, and Gandalf hitting him over the head and taking charge. Well, this isn't right because in the book, Denethor willingly gives authority to Gandalf and tells Pippin and the rest of his men to follow whoever they want because he has given up. However, in the book, Pippin continues to stay with the steward as he wants to hold to his oath to serve Lord Denethor. Which brings us to our next change, albeit a small one, and that is that Pippin doesn't save Gandalf's life during battle. Maybe it happens later on and I just missed it, but at this point in the book, Pippin is still with Denethor and stays with him all the way up until they head to the pyre. And speaking of which, our next couple changes have to do with that whole fiasco, as Denethor heads to burn himself and his son up in flames. Before the book gets to this part, there are some more of those short paragraphs which describe the night and the battle as it raged on. I would highly encourage you to go back and read or listen to this chapter, as it's one of my favorites and I just can't get into every single paragraph in this video. But per usual, Tolkien's writing style for the Siege of Gondor is fantastic. But anyway, back to the changes, there's another omission of Baragon, as after Pippin leaves Denethor in the tomb area, he runs into his friend. Baragon is extremely loyal to his captain, Faramir, and Pippin tells him to not let anything dreadful happen to Faramir while he's gone out searching for Gandalf. Baragon tells him that he isn't allowed in that area, but Pippin says that Denethor is a madman now, and so he's not sure if following his orders is the best thing in this moment. And so Pippin runs off to find Gandalf and leaves Baragon in this sticky situation, which will play a major role in a later chapter. Something key to note here as well is that Pippin doesn't get thrown out like what we see in the movie. Denethor simply tells Pippin that he's released from his service and can go do what he wants. Pippin says that he won't leave Denethor's side, and he follows him all the way up until the point where Pippin realizes what is happening, and then he decides to leave on his own. And now we have our final two changes in Gandalf's encounter with the Witch King, which ends this chapter on a cliffhanger. The first change is that Pippin finds Gandalf down at the gate, just like what we see in the movie, but he doesn't actually speak with Gandalf yet. He arrives and then immediately cowers in fear as the gate busts down from the impact of Grond. The movie shows Gandalf picking Pippin up and riding up to the Citadel only to be stopped by the Witch King on a flying beast. But in the book, the Witch King rides in on a horse after the gate is busted down. And that means we're to the final change. And after all this buildup, you might think that I'd spend an hour talking about this one moment. But in reality, this change is quite cut and dry. The fact is, the Witch King never breaks Gandalf's staff. People get very upset about this scene, and I get it. Don't mess with Gandalf's power. Much like I referenced earlier, the movie seems to try to nerf Gandalf a bit, because after all, if the viewer thought Gandalf was a god essentially, they wouldn't understand the tension. But on the other hand, book fans hate that it's even a possibility, let alone a fact, that the movie has the Witch King overpower the White Wizard. In the book, the Nazgul rides in and they share a few words, but just as the Witch King raises his sword to the sky and prepares to attack, they hear a horn in the distance and look out upon the horizon to see the Rohirrim riding forth. And on that note, the chapter ends. So now that you've heard it all, and congrats to you for sticking till the end by the way, what do you think of these changes? Ultimately, I feel like the two formats do a good job for what they are. For the film, Jackson did a great job executing on the siege and making it look epic and feel real at the same time. Obviously, looking at modern day adaptations, we can see how good the OG trilogy really is. But at the same time, if you're wanting to chill out and get sucked into the story for a few hours, the book is where it's at, because you just get so much more. You just have to dedicate the time to absorb it. So the movies are essentially like Diet Lord of the Rings. But enough of me, now I want to hear from you. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. As always, be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and check out the series playlist in the description to catch up on any episodes you might have missed so far. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.